My name is Robert Hensley, and 3 years ago, I became the laughingstock of Timber Ridge, Montana, population 847, where everyone knows everyone's business, and where building something unusual in your own home is apparently grounds for public mockery and endless speculation about your mental state. I'm a mechanical engineer by training, spent 20 years working for aerospace companies in Seattle, designing thermal management systems for satellites and spacecraft. Good money, interesting work, but the kind of career that slowly grinds you down with office politics, endless meetings, and the soul-crushing realization that you're spending your best years in a cubicle under fluorescent lights. In 2021, at age 48, I'd had enough. I took early retirement, cashed out my 401k, and bought a piece of property in rural Montana, 15 acres of forest with a small rundown cabin that hadn't been occupied in over a decade. The cabin was rough, about 800 square feet. One large room that served as living area and kitchen, a tiny bedroom, and a bathroom that barely functioned. No insulation to speak of, single-pane windows, gaps in the walls where you could see daylight, and a heating system that consisted of an ancient wood stove that consumed massive amounts of firewood while barely keeping the place above freezing. But the property was beautiful, the price was right, and I had plans. Big plans. Plans that would eventually make me the target of ridicule, suspicion, and ultimately, grudging respect from people who'd initially written me off as a crazy city person who didn't understand rural life. The first winter, 2021 to 2022, nearly killed me. Montana winters are no joke. Temperatures regularly dropping to 20 below zero, wind chills that make exposed skin freeze in minutes, snow measured in feet rather than inches. My little cabin, with its non-existent insulation and inefficient wood stove, was a nightmare to heat. I was burning through a cord of wood every 2 weeks, spending hours every day splitting logs and feeding the stove, and still waking up to see my breath in the bedroom, still watching ice form on the inside of the windows. My heating costs, between the firewood I had to buy and the propane I used for backup heat, were running almost $800 a month for 800 square feet. It was unsustainable, miserable, and making me question every decision that had led me to this frozen hellscape. My neighbors, the Johnsons, who lived about a quarter-mile down the road, found my struggles hilarious. Dale Johnson was a third-generation Montanan, a contractor who'd built half the houses in the county, and he made sure everyone knew that the city engineer who'd moved into the old Peterson cabin didn't know the first thing about living in real winter. He'd stop by occasionally, ostensibly to be neighborly, but really to smirk at my massive woodpile and make comments about how a real Montanan would have insulated properly before winter hit, would have known better than to rely on that old stove, would have prepared instead of suffering. His wife Linda was worse, spreading stories around town about how I was going through firewood like it was kindling, about how I'd probably freeze to death before spring, about how typical it was for city people to think they could just move to Montana without understanding what they were getting into. By February 2022, I was desperate, exhausted, and determined to solve this problem. I'm an engineer. I solve problems. That's what I do. So I started researching heating systems, looking for solutions that would work in extreme cold, that would be efficient and cost-effective, that would turn my frozen cabin into a comfortable home. I looked at modern wood stoves, pellet stoves, heat pumps, radiant floor heating, every conventional solution available. But everything had drawbacks. Modern wood stoves were expensive and still required constant feeding. Heat pumps didn't work efficiently in extreme cold. Radiant floor heating required tearing up all my floors and installing expensive systems. Nothing seemed right for my situation, for an old cabin with limited budget and extreme heating demands. Then I stumbled across something in my research that changed everything. It was an ancient heating technology, something that had been used for thousands of years in various cultures, but had been largely forgotten in modern America. It was called a masonry heater, or in some traditions, a Russian fireplace or Finnish contraflow heater. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of a conventional fireplace or stove where most of the heat goes straight up the chimney, a masonry heater uses a complex internal pathway that forces hot gases to travel through a massive amount of masonry, brick or stone, before exiting. The masonry absorbs the heat and then radiates it slowly over many hours, turning the structure itself into a giant thermal battery. You burn a hot, fast fire once or twice a day, and the masonry releases heat continuously for 12 to 24 hours. The efficiency is incredible, often over 90%, compared to 60–70% for a good wood stove and maybe 40% for a traditional fireplace. And because the masonry stores so much heat, you use a fraction of the wood that conventional systems require. But here's where it gets interesting, and where my engineering background came into play. Traditional masonry heaters are standalone structures, basically large brick or stone fireplaces that sit in the middle of a room. But I realized that if I built the masonry heater as an internal wall, running the length of my cabin, I could use it to divide the space while simultaneously heating both sides. And if I extended the masonry down into the floor, creating channels for the hot gases to flow through before exiting, I could heat the floors as well, creating a radiant floor heating system without any of the complexity or cost of conventional systems. It was a hybrid design, combining ancient masonry heater technology with modern understanding of thermal dynamics and airflow. I spent weeks doing calculations, modeling heat transfer, designing the internal pathways that would maximize efficiency while ensuring proper draft and complete combustion. I drew up detailed plans, specifying every dimension, every angle, every component. When I was done, I had a design for a thermal mass wall that would be 24 feet long, 8 feet high, and 18 inches thick, weighing approximately 12,000 pounds, with internal channels that would route hot gases through the wall and under sections of the floor before exiting through a chimney. It would divide my cabin into distinct living and sleeping areas while providing radiant heat to the entire space. It would require only 1 or 2 fires per day, burning hot and fast, consuming maybe 1/10 of the wood I was currently using, and it would maintain comfortable temperatures even when outside temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. I was excited. This was going to work. This was going to transform my cabin from a frozen nightmare into a comfortable, efficient home. I started ordering materials in March 2022, as soon as the weather allowed for construction. Fire brick for the firebox, regular brick for the thermal mass, special refractory mortar, steel doors and dampers, chimney components. I had everything delivered to my property, pallets of materials that cost me about $8,000, which seemed like a lot until I calculated that I'd been spending almost that much per year on heating. The deliveries attracted attention. Dale Johnson stopped by to ask what I was building, and when I tried to explain the concept of a masonry heater and thermal mass wall, he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "You're going to build a wall inside your cabin? A wall that weighs 6 tons? Are you insane? Your floor joists will never support that. You'll collapse the whole structure. And even if you don't, you're going to cut your living space in half for what? Some crazy heating system that probably won't work? Just buy a proper wood stove like a normal person." I tried to explain that I'd done the structural calculations, that the floor joists would support the weight if I added additional support posts in the crawl space, that the design was based on proven technology that had been used for centuries. But Dale wasn't interested in listening. He left shaking his head, and within days, the whole town knew that the crazy city engineer was building a giant wall inside his tiny cabin, wasting thousands of dollars on some harebrained scheme that was definitely going to fail. The mockery intensified when I started construction in April 2022. I had to excavate part of the crawl space to pour a concrete foundation pad that would support the wall's weight. Then I installed additional support posts and beams. Then I started laying brick, course by course, following my detailed plans, creating the complex internal pathways that would route hot gases through the structure. It was slow, meticulous work. I'd never laid brick before, had to teach myself through YouTube videos and trial and error. I made mistakes, had to tear out sections and rebuild them. The project that I'd estimated would take 6 weeks stretched to 3 months. And the whole time people were watching, commenting, laughing. Dale Johnson brought friends by to see the crazy wall, standing in my driveway making jokes loud enough for me to hear. Linda spread stories about how I'd spent my entire retirement savings on a wall that was going to crack and crumble as soon as I lit a fire in it. People in town would ask me about my wall project with barely concealed amusement. clearly thinking I was an idiot who was learning an expensive lesson about the difference between book learning and practical knowledge. The local building inspector came by, summoned by an anonymous complaint, probably from Dale. He examined my work, checked my plans, did his own structural calculations. I held my breath, waiting for him to shut down the project, to tell me Dale was right, and I was risking the entire cabin's integrity. But after 2 hours of inspection, he signed off on it. The design was sound, the construction was solid, and everything met code. I was legal to continue. That should have quieted the critics, but it didn't. If anything, it made them more vocal. Now I wasn't just crazy. I was stubbornly crazy. Too proud to admit I'd made a mistake, throwing good money after bad. By July 2022, the wall was complete. It was magnificent, at least to my eyes. 24 feet of thermal mass, beautiful red brick with a large firebox opening on the living room side, fitted with custom steel doors. The internal pathways were exactly as I'd designed them, creating a route that would force hot gases to travel through approximately 180 feet of channels before exiting, transferring maximum heat to the masonry. The floor sections that incorporated heating channels were finished with tile, creating radiant surfaces that would warm the entire cabin. The total cost had come to about $12,000, including all materials and the few specialized tools I'd had to buy. Now came the moment of truth. I needed to cure the masonry properly, starting with small fires and gradually increasing the temperature over several weeks to drive out moisture and prevent cracking. I started the curing process in late July, and my neighbors watched with anticipation, clearly expecting the whole thing to crack apart or fill the cabin with smoke, or fail in some spectacular way that would vindicate their mockery. But it didn't fail. The first small fires burned perfectly. The draft was strong. The smoke exited cleanly through the chimney. As I gradually increased the fire size over the following weeks, the masonry heated evenly. No cracks appeared, and I could feel warmth radiating from the wall hours after the fire had burned out. It was working exactly as I'd calculated it would, but the real test would come in winter when temperatures dropped and I'd need the system to actually heat the cabin. I spent the rest of the summer and fall finishing other cabin improvements, installing better windows, adding insulation where I could, preparing for winter with a confidence I hadn't felt the previous year. And I waited for the cold, waited for the chance to prove that my crazy wall wasn't crazy at all. The first real cold snap came in late October 2022, temperatures dropping into the teens at night, a preview of the brutal winter to come. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the chance to see if my thermal mass wall would perform as designed. I built my first real fire, not a small curing fire but a proper heating fire, loading the firebox with dry wood and letting it burn hot and fast for about 90 minutes. The flames roared, the firebox glowed, and I could hear the hot gases rushing through the internal channels, exactly as I'd planned. Then I closed the dampers and let the system do its work. Within 2 hours, the entire wall was warm to the touch. Within 4 hours, it was radiating serious heat, warming the cabin to a comfortable 68 degrees, even as outside temperatures dropped to 15 degrees. The tile floors over the heating channels were pleasantly warm, not hot enough to be uncomfortable, but warm enough that walking barefoot was a luxury, and the heat kept coming. 12 hours after the fire had burned out, the wall was still warm, still radiating heat, still keeping the cabin comfortable. I didn't need another fire until the next morning. I was using approximately 1/5 of the wood I'd burned the previous winter, and the cabin was warmer, more comfortable, more evenly heated than it had ever been. The system worked. It worked better than I'd even hoped, but I didn't tell anyone yet. I wanted to wait, wanted to see how it performed in the deep cold of January and February before I started claiming victory. November and December brought progressively colder weather, and my system handled it effortlessly. I developed a routine, built a hot fire in the morning that burned for about 90 minutes, let the thermal mass do its work all day, build another fire in the evening if temperatures were going to drop below zero overnight. On moderately cold days, one fire was enough for 24 hours. Even on the coldest days, 2 fires kept the cabin at a comfortable 65-70 degrees. My wood consumption was minimal. I was going through maybe half a cord per month, compared to the 2 cords per month I'd burned the previous winter. At $200 per quart, I was spending $100 per month on heating instead of $800. The system was paying for itself, and I was comfortable in a way I hadn't been since moving to Montana. But here's what really amazed me: the quality of the heat. Radiant heat from thermal mass is completely different from convective heat from a wood stove or forced air system. It's gentle even, comfortable. There are no hot spots and cold spots, no drafts, no dry air. The walls and floors radiate warmth that you feel on your skin, that warms objects in the room rather than just the air. It's the same kind of heat you feel from the sun on a cool day, and it's incredibly pleasant. I found myself walking around barefoot in the middle of winter, something I'd never done in the old cabin. I could sit anywhere in the space and be comfortable. The bedroom on the other side of the thermal wall stayed warm all night from the heat radiating through the masonry. I was sleeping better, feeling better, enjoying my cabin in ways I hadn't thought possible. In January 2023, we had a cold snap that tested the system thoroughly. Temperatures dropped to 28 below zero, with wind chills approaching 50 below. This was the kind of cold that had made the previous winter miserable, where I'd burned wood constantly and still been cold. I built 2 fires per day, morning and evening, burning them hot and fast. And the cabin stayed comfortable. Not just tolerable, but genuinely comfortable. 68 degrees throughout. Warm floors, no cold drafts, no frozen windows. I used less than a quart of wood for the entire month of January. That's when people started noticing. Dale Johnson stopped by in early February, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but really to see how I was surviving the cold. He expected to find me huddled next to a roaring fire, burning through wood, suffering like I had the previous year. Instead, he found me in a t-shirt, barefoot, reading a book in a cabin that was warmer than his own house. I saw his expression change from smug expectation to confusion to something that might have been respect. "How are you heating this place?" he asked, looking around. "I don't see a fire. I don't even see smoke from your chimney." "I had a fire this morning," I said. "The wall stores the heat and releases it slowly. I won't need another fire until tonight, and only because it's supposed to drop to 20 below." Dale walked over to the thermal wall and placed his hand on it. It was warm, radiating steady heat hours after the fire had burned out. He looked at the tile floors, felt their warmth, and I could see him doing calculations in his head, trying to understand how this was possible. "This actually works," he said, and there was genuine surprise in his voice. "You built a 6-ton wall inside your cabin, and it actually works. How much wood are you using?" "About half a quart per month," I said. "Maybe $100 in heating costs, total even in the coldest weather." Dale was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "I owe you an apology. I thought you were crazy. I told everyone you were wasting your money on some stupid city engineer idea that would never work. But this is incredible. This is the most efficient heating system I've ever seen." Word spread quickly after that. Dale, to his credit, told people he'd been wrong, that my thermal wall was actually brilliant, that I'd solved a heating problem that every rural Montanan faced. Linda stopped spreading negative stories and started asking questions about how the system worked. And suddenly, instead of being the town joke, I was the guy with the amazing heating system that everyone wanted to see. People started stopping by, asking for tours, wanting to understand how a wall could heat a house. I explained the principles, showed them the firebox and the internal pathways, let them feel the radiant heat from the masonry and the warm floors. I showed them my wood consumption records, my heating cost calculations, the temperature logs I'd been keeping. The evidence was undeniable. I'd built something that worked better than conventional systems, cost less to operate, and provided superior comfort. By March 2023, I'd had over 50 visitors, people from all over the county coming to see the thermal wall. Some were just curious, but many were homeowners and builders who were genuinely interested in the technology, who wanted to know if they could implement similar systems in their own homes. I started getting requests to consult on projects, to help people design masonry heaters for their properties. Dale Johnson, the contractor who'd mocked me most loudly, asked if I'd be willing to partner with him on a project. He had a client building a new home who wanted the most efficient heating system possible, and Dale thought a thermal mass wall would be perfect. He admitted he didn't have the engineering knowledge to design it properly, But if I'd provide the design and oversee the construction, he'd handle the actual building. I agreed, and we completed that first collaborative project in summer 2023. It was a larger system than mine, a thermal wall that was 32 feet long and incorporated even more sophisticated features, including a baking oven built into the masonry and a heated bench. The clients were thrilled with the results, and Dale was impressed enough that he wanted to make masonry heaters a standard offering in his construction business. We formed an informal partnership. I'd design the systems, do the engineering calculations, specify the materials and construction methods. Dale and his crew would do the actual building. We completed 6 projects in 2023, each one unique, each one tailored to the specific needs of the property and the client. And every single one worked beautifully, providing efficient, comfortable heat while dramatically reducing wood consumption and heating costs. The jealous neighbors who'd laughed at my crazy wall were now asking me to design systems for them. Linda Johnson wanted one for their house. Other people who'd mocked me were suddenly interested in learning more, in admitting that maybe the city engineer had known what he was doing after all. By winter 2023-2024, my second winter with the thermal wall, I'd refined my technique even further. I knew exactly how much wood to burn, exactly when to build fires, exactly how to adjust for different weather conditions. My heating costs for the entire winter were under $500, compared to the nearly $5,000 I'd spent that first winter. I was comfortable, warm, and vindicated. But more than that, I'd started something. I'd reintroduced an ancient technology to a modern context, had proven that sometimes the old ways, combined with modern engineering understanding, work better than contemporary solutions. I'd shown that you don't always need expensive, complex systems to solve problems. Sometimes you just need thermal mass, good design, and a willingness to build something that looks crazy until it works. By spring 2024, 3 years after I'd started this journey, the thermal wall in my cabin had become something of a local legend. People drove from hours away to see it, to feel the radiant heat, to understand how something so simple could work so effectively. I'd been featured in a regional magazine, had been invited to speak at a sustainable building conference, and had a waiting list of clients who wanted me to design masonry heaters for their properties. But the real impact went beyond just the heating systems I was designing. The thermal wall had sparked a broader conversation about energy efficiency, about sustainable living, about questioning conventional wisdom and being willing to try solutions that seemed unconventional. People were starting to think differently about heating, about building, about the assumptions they'd always made about what worked and what didn't. Dale Johnson and I had completed 15 projects by mid-2024, each one a custom design tailored to the specific property and client needs. We'd built thermal walls in tiny cabins and large homes, had incorporated features like baking ovens and heated benches, and even a heated greenhouse wall. Every single system performed beautifully, and every single client reported dramatic reductions in heating costs and improvements in comfort. The economics were compelling. A typical masonry heater system cost between $10,000 and $25,000 to install, depending on size and complexity. But it would reduce heating costs by 60–80% compared to conventional systems, meaning it paid for itself in 3 to 7 years. After that, it was pure savings, year after year for the life of the system, which could easily be 50 years or more with proper maintenance. But beyond the economics, there was something else that people responded to. There was a quality to living with radiant heat from thermal mass that was hard to quantify, but deeply satisfying. Multiple clients told me that their homes felt different, more comfortable, more peaceful. The even, gentle heat created an environment that was fundamentally more pleasant than what they'd experienced with forced air or conventional wood stoves. One client, an elderly woman who'd lived in Montana her entire life, told me that the thermal wall I'd designed for her reminded her of her grandmother's house in Finland, where they'd had a traditional masonry heater. She said she'd forgotten how wonderful that kind of heat felt. How it warmed not just the air, but everything in the room. How it made winter feel less harsh and more bearable. That conversation made me realize something important. This technology wasn't new. It had been used for centuries in cold climates around the world, but it had been largely forgotten in America. replaced by modern systems that were more convenient to install but less efficient and less comfortable to live with. I wasn't inventing anything. I was rediscovering and adapting ancient wisdom, combining it with modern engineering to create systems that worked better than either ancient or modern approaches alone. The jealous neighbors who'd laughed at me had taught me an important lesson, though not the one they'd intended. They'd taught me that mockery and skepticism are often just fear of the unfamiliar, resistance to anything that challenges conventional thinking. Dale Johnson had laughed at my wall because it was different, because it didn't fit his understanding of how heating systems should work, because admitting it might be a good idea would have required him to question his own expertise and experience. But once he'd seen the results, once he'd felt the warm floors and understood the efficiency and recognized that this actually worked, he'd been willing to change his mind. He'd been willing to admit he'd been wrong, to learn something new, to incorporate this technology into his own work. That willingness to change, to adapt, to admit when you're wrong, that's what separates people who grow from people who stagnate. I'd also learned something about the value of expertise in education. I'm an engineer. I spent 20 years learning about thermal dynamics, heat transfer, material properties, all the technical knowledge that allowed me to design a system that worked. When people had mocked my wall, they'd been dismissing that expertise, assuming that practical experience was more valuable than technical knowledge, that a contractor who'd built houses for 30 years knew more than an engineer with advanced degrees. But the truth is, both kinds of knowledge are valuable. Dale's practical building experience was essential to actually constructing the systems I designed. My engineering knowledge was essential to designing systems that would work efficiently and safely. The best results came from combining both kinds of expertise, from respecting both practical and theoretical knowledge. By fall 2024, I'd been living with my thermal wall for 2 full winters and was heading into my 3rd. The system had performed flawlessly, had required minimal maintenance, and had transformed my cabin from a frozen nightmare into a comfortable home. My total heating costs for 2 winters had been under $1,000, compared to the nearly $10,000 I would have spent with conventional heating. The wall had paid for itself in saved heating costs and would continue saving me money for decades to come. But the financial savings, while significant, weren't the most important benefit. The most important benefit was the quality of life improvement. I was comfortable in my home, genuinely comfortable, in a way that I hadn't been that first winter. I could walk around barefoot in January. I could sleep without piling on blankets. I could enjoy winter instead of just enduring it. That comfort, that sense of being warm and cozy, even when outside temperatures were brutal, was worth more than any amount of money saved. The thermal wall had also given me a new career, or at least a meaningful retirement project. I was designing heating systems, consulting on sustainable building projects, teaching workshops about masonry heaters and thermal mass. I'd found a way to use my engineering skills in a practical, tangible way that helped people and made a real difference in their lives. It was more satisfying than anything I'd done in my aerospace career. And I'd gained respect in my community, had gone from being the crazy city engineer to being someone whose expertise was valued and sought after. The same people who'd mocked me were now asking for my advice, were recommending me to friends, were acknowledging that maybe I'd known what I was doing after all. Dale and Linda Johnson had become genuine friends. We'd worked together on enough projects that we'd developed mutual respect and trust. Dale had learned to value technical knowledge and careful planning. I'd learned to value practical experience and craftsmanship. Together, we made a good team, and we were building systems that were changing how people in our region thought about heating and energy efficiency. Looking back on the journey, from that first brutal winter to becoming a local expert on thermal mass heating, I realized that the mockery and skepticism I'd faced had actually been valuable. It had forced me to be thorough, to document everything, to prove beyond any doubt that my system worked. If everyone had been supportive from the beginning, I might have been less careful, less meticulous, less determined to get every detail right. The resistance I'd faced had made me better, had made my designs more robust, had ensured that when I finally proved the system worked, the proof was undeniable. The jealous neighbors had laughed when I built a wall inside my cabin. They'd called me crazy, wasteful, stupid. They'd predicted failure and spread stories about my foolishness. But then winter came, and the wall heated my floors, warmed my entire cabin with a fraction of the wood conventional systems required, and proved that sometimes the crazy ideas are the ones that work best. Now those same neighbors ask me for advice. They want thermal walls in their own homes. They want to understand the principles, to learn from my experience, to benefit from the technology I'd reintroduce to our region. And I'm happy to help them, because that's what this has always been about. Not about being right or proving people wrong, but about finding better solutions, about living more comfortably and sustainably, about rediscovering wisdom that had been forgotten and adapting it for modern use. My name is Robert Hensley, and I built a 6-ton wall inside my 800-square-foot cabin. People thought I was insane, but that wall heats my floors, warms my home with minimal wood, and costs me less than $500 per winter to operate. It's the best decision I've made since moving to Montana, and it's changed not just my life, but the lives of dozens of other people who've built similar systems based on my design. Sometimes the crazy ideas are the ones worth pursuing. Sometimes ancient technology combined with modern engineering works better than contemporary solutions. And sometimes the people who laugh at you end up asking you to teach them how to do what they once mocked. That's the story of my thermal wall, and the lesson I learned about innovation, persistence, and the value of being willing to build something that looks crazy until it works.